Sahar Aziz, who's a professor at the Rutgers Law School in the US, professor of law and chancellor of social justice scholar. And she's also founding director of interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. She's also a renowned public speaker and very frequent media appearances. So it's a great pleasure, and I think it's extremely timely to have this roundtable. And now, while of course the US and also many other countries are experiencing a new wave of protests triggered by the police brutality and assassination of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So there are quite a number of issues that certainly will pop up during the discussion. But the idea, of course, was for Sahar to discuss her recent research on online activism, which is a phenomenon where individuals transform social media platform into a political platform. And of course, this invites state and police surveillance, which of course combines with all the policing of particularly targeting certain minorities such as Black communities and Muslim communities. And the parallels between the US, I would say even Western countries and the Middle East certainly could be drawn. I would say, without further ado, that I would now pass the floor to Sahar for about, as Sarah mentioned, about 30 minutes presentation, and then we hope to have a very lively discussion. Sahar, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for all of those who are online. We didn't anticipate that the current events that are happening today would be at the same time that I'm giving this presentation. As some of you may know, it was originally planned a few weeks ago, and we were going to focus on COVID-19 pandemic, but now actually the article on which my presentation is based is even more timely and squarely on point, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to thank the EUI for inviting me, and I have a lot of respect for this institution. I've had the honor and privilege of visiting it. Not only is the campus beautiful, but it is well known for attracting the highest caliber academics and scholars in Europe and around the world. So I feel honored to present before you today. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint to help to articulate kind of the main thesis and the main concepts. So let me just do that right now. Okay. So hopefully you can see this. This presentation is based on an article. If you want to go in depth and take the time to read the details and the footnotes and the sources and the citations, it's called "Fear of a Black and Brown Internet: Policing Online Activism." This is an article that I co-authored with Professor Khalid Beydoun, and it's coming out in the Boston University Law Review. It's also available on ssrn.com. If you just Google that name, you will find it, and it's freely accessible. So I would encourage you to read it if you want to know more. Okay, so just make sure. So the two research questions that animated this project is, how has counterterrorism enforcement adapted to the increase in online activism? And how does US law protect civil liberties of online activists, especially those engaged in Black Lives Matter and Islamophobia, and combating Islamophobia? Because, as you know, these are issues that have affected minority communities, and particularly the communities that I've been researching for now nearly 20 years, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And I have a book coming out called The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, where I take a very deep dive into looking at why Muslim communities and those who are raised as Muslim or perceived as Muslims are being treated so openly discriminatorily as a result of post 9/11. But you can't really understand minority communities in the United States in general. You can't understand how they're being discriminated against in the myriad ways without understanding anti-Black racism, because at least I take the position that, and this is not a novel position, this is Derek Bell's work, Joe Fagan's work, many other scholars, that the black-white paradigm is the kind of master paradigm to understand race relations in the US and how minorities are treated, whether they're immigrants, whether they're native born, whether they're Native Americans. And so you have to understand that backdrop. So this article is one of various projects to try to compare the parallels, what's similar and what's different between the way in which African American communities are treated and the way in which Muslim communities are treated. And 30% of Muslims in the United States are African American. So there's a lot of intersectionality and overlap in those different identity groups. And then I'm focusing particularly on the policing of online activism in light of social media becoming our new normal. Okay, so, you know, in the background, we talk about the evolution of political activism, which I think we all know is heavily dependent on the physical circumstances, the technology that's available, the freedoms that are available legally, and the social norms. And so there was a point in time when it was town hall meetings and it was leaflets and it was people going from door to door or in these very localized contexts, particularly before we had mass transportation available. But then starting in the early to mid 20th century, we started to get newspapers and radio and television to become the primary mediums in which communication was distributed. And then you could start going from within a state, across states, across the country, and to some extent internationally. But one thing that is distinct about that modem of communication and media is that it was top down. There were gatekeepers, right? They were editors, they were producers, they were reporters. And so oftentimes the way things were framed and the way that stories were told and from whose perspectives and whose voices and who was interviewed was controlled by these gatekeepers. And at least in the United States, most of those gatekeepers came from the dominant majority, which is predominantly white and predominantly Judeo-Christian perspective. And so that limited whose voice was heard and the narratives that you heard. And in large part, one can attribute that top-down paradigm to why the war on drugs was so successful in vilifying African-American men as violent and as drug dealers and as these threats to society. You can see the Central Park Five, which is the latest, highest profile documentary about these 5 African-American boys who were blamed for the vicious rape of a white woman in Central Park, when in fact they had not committed the crime. Later they were exonerated. But the media portrayals of Black men being violent and being criminal made it where the public was willing to accept those types of accusations without questioning. So the radical, what's radical about the internet and social media in particular is now you have this bottom-up form of communication that has really empowered citizen journalism, and it's empowered individuals who now can become influencers without having to go through the gatekeepers, right? You don't have to wait to be invited on CNN or MSNBC or whatever your mainstream media outlet is in order to get your voice out there. And as we've seen, there are many people now who, at some point were obscure and opaque and nobody knew who they were, and now they have hundreds of thousands of followers, and they're more influential in the perspectives that they bring and share than some of the mainstream media outlets. So social media, I think it goes without saying, has revolutionized many things about our society. And so here we're focusing really on activism and the ability for particularly minority communities to now overcome whatever gatekeeping there is and to be able to openly challenge and directly challenge the hierarchies, the social, political, and economic hierarchies that have produce these systemic inequalities in society. And, I always try to look at the silver lining of things. I'm a social justice scholar, so everything I do is depressing in some ways. We're always looking at the way people's rights are violated, the way people are mistreated and abused and wrongfully convicted, and et cetera. It's a difficult area of expertise to have, just from an emotional perspective. So you always have to be thinking about what's the silver lining, what's the good that's going to come out of all this hardship. And so when I was looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, I think one of, if we want to be optimistic, is that at least in the United States, it really just shined a very glaring light on economic inequality and how that overlaps with race, and how that translates into the absence of affordable and quality healthcare, how it puts people vulnerable to being infected because of their dependency on their wages, and they're essential workers, and yet they're underpaid, they don't get overtime, they don't get hazard pay, and the disproportionate number of brown and Black communities who were unemployed. In the currently, I think we've reached now 40 million to 42 million unemployment claims in the United States. And so those of us who study these issues, we already knew this, but it was one of the first times, at least in my lifetime, where I saw economic inequality overlapping with race being reported on every single day, multiple times a day in mainstream media. Whereas these discussions were occurring in social media, but again, they didn't have kind of, I think that they had different impact. So social media has, been a parallel universe, but also has driven mainstream media. Okay, so this is kind of one of the mini litany of horribles, or the parade of horribles in terms of racial and religious profiling that infects at least the United States criminal justice system. And these are issues that have been around for decades. And if you talk to historians, particularly historians of African-American communities or of race and civil rights, they'll tell you that many of these types of practices are simply the newest iteration of practices that occurred during slavery, or practices that occurred during Reconstruction or during the Jim Crow era. So a lot of this is not necessarily new in terms of the roots of it, and it's just new in terms of its manifestations. So there's always been the struggle in the US between how a predominantly white society has attempted to keep power concentrated among people who are raced, and it's a social construction, right? Being white or being Black is a social construction. It's not a biological fact, but keeping power concentrated among whatever group falls into whiteness, and denying power from whatever group falls into Black. And then you have immigrants that go in between, or different types of races and ethnicities that go in between. And then there's a competition effectively of who can be white in order to get those privileges, and who can avoid Blackness in order to avoid the harms and the discrimination that comes with being Black. So I'll just go very briefly. I have this list on the fly on the slide. So we know about the Stop and Frisk program, which is effectively blatant racial profiling, and it was very pervasive in New York City, where police would just decide, okay, this African-American man, and to some extent also a Latino man, look suspicious, they stop them and they frisk them immediately. And this was part of the war on drugs. It's extremely humiliating, and it's also an entry point into the criminal justice system, because if you're found with just a small joint of marijuana, when there was a very aggressive drug enforcement, you got into the system, and once you were in the system, then you got into the mass incarceration system. And then you had a record, and then you couldn't vote, and then you couldn't get a job, and you were stigmatized. So the system was structured to essentially make it very, very difficult, particularly for young African-American men, to be able to take advantage of the so-called American dream, right, of taking of social mobility. There were traps everywhere, whether they were in the schools or in the streets. Excessive force is what we are seeing now on full display. And those of us who were paying attention to the social media movements in 2014, 2015, 16, when you had Trayvon Martin, when you had Freddie Gray, and these are the essential murders of Black men that have been going on for decades. So I think what's important to know is George Floyd is just the latest. When I was coming of age, the Rodney King case was what I witnessed, and that was my first exposure to anti-Black violence by the police. 4 white police officers are acquitted, and you have riots, they send in the National Guard, but as we're now, almost 20 years later or 30 years later, and not much has changed, at least in terms of police continuing to engage in this type of violence against Black men. Now, there's also a kind of a parallel in terms of racial and religious profiling focused on immigrants. So whether they're immigration sweeps, exclusion of asylum seekers, as we saw as we saw on the border with Mexico with Central Americans and the border wall. And this is also racialized, and it also is based on stereotypes of Latino people or Latino men coming, they're criminals, they're rapists. We remember this very divisive rhetoric from Trump when both when he was running for office and when he became president. But you have to create that enemy, right? You have to create these negative stereotypes in order to get the public to just blindly follow through and not ask questions such as, these people are coming because they're getting jobs, because they're filling positions that Americans don't want to take, right? These are people that are coming and they're working hard, and many of them are paying taxes, whether or not they're documented, right? These are people who are not, if the crime rate's actually quite low among immigrants. But similarly, when there was an exclusion of Syrian refugees, there was very little information about how many of these refugees, whether they were from Syria, Middle Eastern countries, or other countries in the world, were actually entrepreneurs, and many of them didn't really require social services beyond 1 or 2 years, and their kids tended to become highly socially mobile. But again, none of that is portrayed when you are using a very racist narrative. And then finally, you have the national security paradigm and the counterterrorism paradigm, where you base it on this terrorist other stereotype of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. Now, the good news on counterterrorism is that in terms of numbers, there haven't been as many Muslims, and they're mainly men, that have been swept into what I call counterterrorism mass incarceration system. But there have been very high profile, and they've been very, very aggressive. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm talking numbers in comparison to African American men in terms of mass incarceration. And there's many reasons for that difference. Part of it is because of the socioeconomics of the different communities. And part of it is just because Muslims are only at most 3% of the population. But what you're seeing, what you've always seen, is what we call kind of this bleeding into with the foundation being anti-Black racism, and then that becoming the foundation for anti-Asian racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Latino racism. Okay. So these are just some of the various hashtags and the various causes that became quite pervasive and created quite a bit of online activism starting in 2013, 2014. And Twitter and Facebook didn't publicly launch until 2006. So it took some time before it took off and people started using it as a medium of information and communication and advocacy. And as you see, there's also the Me Too movement, which is the women's rights, or the attempt of the women's rights movement to make a reemergence in the United States. But much of this, what was happening was very fascinating, because there was a switch from the physical to the virtual, right, to social media. And there were a lot of critiques by what maybe we'll call old guard activists and old school activists who said, okay, this young generation, yes, they're very active online, but how is that actually changing things in reality? How is that reforming police departments? How is that reforming immigration enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security and these various institutions that they're protesting against online? And so I think that's something that we continue to struggle with. And what's interesting about the current protests against the murder of George Floyd is they are going out into the streets, and at the same time there's the online activism. So the third link, the missing link, is, will the online activism, the physical activism, then translate into the actual change of institutions who have the power and the money and the legal authority to enforce or not enforce certain laws? But these are still open questions. All right, so I want to now turn to, so we focused on two parts, two particular types of online activism in this paper. The first one was countering violent extremism, and then the other was Black identity extremism. Sorry, those were the responses of the US government to the activism by these two communities. So countering violent extremism is actually a liberal frame that is attempting to change the narrative that still targets Muslims. So under Bush, it was called countering Islamic terrorism. And as you can imagine, many Muslim American communities were very offended by that, because by putting Islamic right before terrorism, it presumes that all Muslims are terrorists. It presumes Islam is a terroristic religion. And so there was a lot of critique and advocacy not to use Islamic terrorism. So when Obama came into power, he said, okay, I'm going to change the name. I'm going to change it to countering violent extremism, because it is facially neutral and in theory means it's not just about Muslims. However, in practice, it was about Muslims, and has always been about Muslims. I wrote a piece called Policing Terrorists in the Community that goes into a deep dive about critiquing these CVE programs, if you'd like to read it. But effectively what this did is it was started out as a physical initiative where FBI agents, DHS agents, TSA, which is a Transportation Security Administration, DHS is Department of Homeland Security, local police departments, attorney generals would have these meetings in their local cities and invite Muslim communities, invite imams, invite student leaders, invite nonprofit organizations to come and do community engagement. And under the auspices of, look, we want to work with you. You're not our enemy. We know that you're just as much against terrorism committed by Muslims. We know that you're not necessarily guilty of it, or that was the rhetoric they used. But what was discovered, and also they invited them to come and tell them about their grievances, their civil rights grievances, of how they were being secondarily screened and humiliated in airports, how there was a targeting of Muslim or immigrants from Muslim majority countries in immigration enforcement and deportation, the material support to terrorism, etc. So many of these groups came in good faith thinking, okay, we're going to work with the government. But what they found was, one, the government did nothing about their grievances. They would just listen to them and no action was taken. And number two, they used the meetings to gather intel about the communities and to gather names about individuals or people there. And then they would go offline and try to recruit informants. Or they would go and investigate individuals to see if they could flip them or if they could deport them. So it took some time for the communities to figure this out. But now I think, at least within many Muslim communities, CVE has been discredited, although that took many, many years to do. And I was part of that movement before I became an academic to warn the community that these are really pretextual initiatives that are really a surveillance tool. Now, where this goes to online activism is, once Twitter and Facebook became more and more prevalent, and once, especially after Trump was running for office, 2015 was a peak of hate crimes against Muslims, in part because of Trump's rhetoric and other Republican nominees' rhetoric. But you had more and more online activism. And that's happening, and at the same time, and this is actually pre-Trump, many of you may know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were using social media to try to recruit individuals in the West, right? So a Muslim in the United States was someone that they wanted to be a lone wolf terrorist. So there was some bona fide concerns about recruitment, but it wasn't nearly as serious as the way that the government responded. So what they started to do is they would send they would do online sting operations that would look for people who were engaging in dissident or quote unquote radical rhetoric online, and then they would take them offline, and some of them would eventually be ensnared in a plot that was orchestrated by an informant or an undercover agent. So that was something that was of great concern to the Muslim community. So I've gone over some of that in this slide. So the surveillance, the prosecution, and the cooptation. And I recommend that you look at the NYPD surveillance program as something that is very clearly evidence that mass surveillance was a very serious initiative by many law enforcement agencies, including federal and state and local. Okay. So you've got CVE on the one hand, and then you have something called Black identity extremism. And Black identity extremism is actually a play off of CVE. So CVE has been going on in different iterations under different names since 2001. Black identity extremism is essentially using that same framework of, we're going to start targeting who we believe are extremists. And this is part of a preventative counterterrorism paradigm, because in counterterrorism, in contrast to maybe what we'll call traditional criminal justice, you want to prevent the terrorist act before it happens, whereas in traditional criminal justice, the drug deal already happened, the murder already happened, the assault happened, and then you're trying to solve the crime. So this preventative model poses serious risks to civil liberties, because how are you going to determine whether someone may be planning a terrorist plot? Well, what the police are doing and law enforcement are doing is they're engaging in thought policing and ideological litmus tests, and determining that if you're dissident or quote unquote radical, you are somebody and you're Muslim, and now with BIE and you're Black, you're going to be prioritized. And under at least the US system and under US law, this is really problematic, because the whole point of the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of expression association is to protect dissidents, right? It's not to protect the mainstream and the majority view or the popular views, because they don't need legal protection. The society and societal norms and the power structure will protect them. So it's very problematic to have that preventative model, especially in the era of social media, when it's all verbal, right? It's all talk, it's all writing. It's the essence of what online activism is. So in 2017, in response to the Ferguson protests, right, and in response to the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, the FBI, Domestic Terrorism Analyst Unit in the Counterterrorism Division, issued a 12-page report that was eventually disclosed through a Freedom of Information Act request by some advocacy groups, that essentially said, we're going to be focused on African Americans whose perceptions of police brutality against African Americans increases premeditated, retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement. So essentially what it is anybody who is criticizing the police, particularly in particular ways, is now going to be targeted for surveillance. And once you're targeted for surveillance, and not just surveillance, they send online provocateurs, right? Again, they're trying to lead people into sting operations, because this is exactly what they did with counterterrorism with Muslims, is they will egg them on and say, well, how are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? Well, how should we, okay, are you going to buy that? We have a report coming out under the Center for Security, Race and Rights that's going to go into a deep dive on these sting operations, but they're really problematic. And my view is many of them are manufactured because they need to inflate their numbers to justify their work and to get more money. Now, what is particularly troubling about BIE is it's actually a blast to the past. So, you know, if you've read the history of COINTELPRO of the 1950s, 1960s, and to some extent the 1970s, this was an enormous program under J. Edgar Hoover, under the FBI, and part of the McCarthyist era, is where they were focusing on African American communities. They sent agent provocateurs, they infiltrated them. Now, there was no social media, so it was all physical. And this was, you know, most of the modem of communication was television and radio at the time, and newspapers. The Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Martin Luther King, and all of this has come out. It's rarely talked about in mainstream media, but those who study this are looking and going, wait a minute, this is just the beginning of, this is a regression back. Okay, so I'm a lawyer and I'm a law professor, so there's always the question for me is, well, what does the law have to do with it? Has the law protected these individuals? Does the law facilitate these types of civil liberties infringements? And unfortunately, at least when it comes to social media, the law is far behind the times. And many justices on the Supreme Court know this. The issue now is whether Congress needs to either legislate or the Supreme Court needs to interpret the doctrines to take into account how social media has changed the way in which people communicate and in which people advocate. So I will quickly, because I know a lot of the people listening are not lawyers, so I don't want to go too granular, but there are four main doctrines that affect privacy and technology: the open fields doctrine, the misplaced trust doctrine, the reasonable expectation of privacy, and the third-party doctrine. So the open fields doctrine, effectively, this came out in a decision in 1924 in the Supreme Court. This is that anything you leave out in public, in this case, it was leaving something out in your front yard. It was moonshine, a jug of moonshine, and this was during the Prohibition era. That if you leave it out in the front yard, it's in the open fields, which means that at least law enforcement can pick it up and use it against you. Right? You do not have an expectation of privacy. They don't have to get a judicial warrant. in order to take that. So anything that's out in public is fair game for law enforcement to surveil and to collect and to use against you. So as you can imagine, with social media and with Twitter and with Facebook, if you're posting it, you're essentially saying, look, I'm letting anybody see it, including the police. It gets more tricky though, and I think most people will agree that, okay, you have, at least in terms of the police or law enforcement, FBI reading it, you have assumed that risk, you have waived any privacy rights. It gets really tricky though when, what if you send it to a small group of people? What if you're direct messaging? Whether it's a private Facebook group or a private Twitter group. That's where courts have struggled quite a bit to try to figure out, well, if the police have infiltrated that group, or if somebody has shared it with law enforcement, can that be used against you in a court of law? So there's something called the misplaced doctrine, which effectively means that you have no protection, no privacy rights when it comes to informants. So this was when the government was going after Jimmy Hoffa, who was a major labor organizer, and he had disclosed actions he took that were in violation of the law to one of his confidants, one of his advisors in the labor union, and it turned out that this person was also an informant. So then he testified against him, and when Hoffa's lawyers tried to challenge that, the court said, no, if you disclosed it to him, and if he's an informant, you essentially waived any privacy, and if he's an informant, that's your bad luck. So that's where informants are very, very powerful in terms of gathering information that you aren't necessarily disclosing to the public. And then and all of this is kind of under the reasonable expectation of privacy doctrine, which is this very fuzzy, opaque, normative concept that courts ask every time something comes before them and says, well, is there a reasonable expectation of privacy in our society at this point in time? And social media has actually narrowed that test such that there's very few things that fall under being private, because with this new generation that discloses everything about themselves on Instagram and their pictures and where they eat and where they sleep and when they leave the house and that causes judges to look at society and go, oh, well, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy on this type of information. So this is a test that lawyers are constantly struggling with, and many Fourth Amendment advocates say that it's almost a dead doctrine because judges tend to be very favorable to police and to the government's position when it comes to having a very narrow interpretation. And again, these things come up when the prosecution is trying to bring forth evidence that they've collected against the defendant. And then finally, the third party doctrine, which directly affects social media, says that if you voluntarily disclose information to a third party, in other words, a non-government party like Twitter, like Facebook, like Instagram, you have waived any privacy rights. So that would, in theory, mean direct messaging. That would, in theory, mean all your information on your profile page, who your friends are, even if you keep that private. And that has created quite a bit of controversy within civil liberties circles. There's a lot of efforts to reform it because the US Constitution protects you from state action, federal action, and the state constitutions protect you from literally states action. So this third party doctrine says, well, you gave it to Twitter, so if Twitter wants to give it to the police or to the FBI, they can do it. And then you get into these debates about, well, should there be so in other words, they don't need a judicial warrant. And then they will issue an administrative subpoena. And then the question is, well, does the user have a right to know that there's been a subpoena about their information, their Twitter account, so they can go challenge it in court? So the law is not on civil liberties, on the side of civil liberties right now when it comes to online activism, unfortunately. So that then leaves grassroots local initiatives as the primary means in which civil liberties advocates have been trying. Now, this is very difficult because then you have to go one by one, one town at a time. Because the only thing that will protect you from surveillance is if you can show and prove, which is very difficult to do, that the surveillance was based solely on your race, your religion, your political beliefs or association. And when you're in counterterrorism or criminal justice, it's very easy for the government to say, no, this had nothing to do with the target being Black or being Muslim or being Latino. This was really about this security issue or this counterterrorism threat. So in Oakland, California, which many of you may know is a very progressive city, they passed a local ordinance that requires a technology impact report to be issued to the Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission, right, by the police department. And that then discloses whatever new technologies they're using. Because oftentimes, the police will do these things without telling the public, and you only find out about it when there's a high profile case. And then you discover, what, all this time you've been tracking our cell phone movement, our cell phone through our movements, our license plate readers, GPS systems, etc. So at least it creates more transparency. There's also something that is called the Community Control Over Police Surveillance, CCOPS. And this is an umbrella group that is attempting to essentially implement similar initiatives that happen in Oakland and other localities and other jurisdictions that would increase the transparency, and also to legally redefine that expectation of privacy that would bar social media, indiscriminate social media monitoring. So even though, yes, you can physically, you're a police officer, you have the physical ability to read somebody's social media monitoring. The question is, why are you doing that? Because you have a lot of power as a police officer. Impose public oversight, regulate the usage of these new technologies, and then prohibit sharing of social media unless there is some reasonable suspicion of a specific articulable criminal activity, which is a legal term, and it's one of the lowest standards in the law. It's much lower than, say, probable cause of criminal activity. So these are the types of initiatives that are going on. I think they're like drops in the bucket. Because it's one by one by one. I think the silver lining of what's happening in these awful, devastating, current events with the murder of George Floyd and the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, which is that people are becoming more aware. And so the question is, can we start translating reforms at the federal level, ideally, or at least at the state level, so that at least police departments, because I think one of the most important issues when dealing with the police is deterrence. And because you have very strong police unions that tend not to want any kind of interference in what they do, they're very powerful. And if you are a mayor or you are a governor and your police department is at war with you, you're going to have a really hard time governing. Something of an aside, those of you who are paying attention to what happened in Egypt, one of, I think, the downfalls of the Morsi regime was when the police boycotted his regime, right? The police punished Morsi because they were opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they refused to go out into the street, and they refused to do their job. And so crime skyrocketed. And who was to blame? Morsi was to blame because he was the president. So police departments are not, this is not the institution that if you're an elected official, you want to upset. They have a lot of power to be subversive and to undermine your authority. So it's a tricky situation. And I can talk more about qualified immunity if anybody has questions of why these police officers in general historically have not been found guilty, particularly in civil suits, because that's also a failure in the law. But with that, I'll end so that I can open it up for questions. Thank you very much for your interest in this subject and for taking the time out of your busy days to hear my presentation. And I very much look forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Now we're opening the floor to questions. I think you've given us quite a big comprehensive overview of a number of issues. And I think our audience is now reflecting a bit on the questions. Perhaps before we try to get some, I will ask you, particularly in view of the current developments in the US, you mentioned, activists who have been